So I think the impact on workers' comp is going to be as much in how workers' compensation operates from a claims underwriting management executive world than in actually how the risks that we actually handle.
You're listening to Beyond the Claim, the show for forward-thinking risk and claims professionals curious about the latest industry trends, winning strategies, and stories from influential leaders. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Beyond the Claim. I'm your host, Mark Cunningham, Chief Sales and Marketing Officer for Broadspire. With me today, I have Joe Paduda. Joe is an industry expert in the managed care space, speaker, media resource, as well as author. And Joe is president of Comp Pharma, as well as owner of Health Strategy Associates. Joe, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate you bringing me on today. Thanks for the honor.
Absolutely. So, Joe, for those of us out there, or those folks out there that aren't familiar with the managed care space, what's your take on it? As folks stop you and say, what do you do over the years? What do you say?
Well, I say I know an awful lot about very little, that very little being the workers' comp medical management space. I've been doing this for 30 plus years, was involved in the first workers' comp PPO we built for AIG way back in the day. But managed care is basically everything that has to do with managing the medical delivery part of the work comp claim. But I sit on the board of a dual eligible Medicare Medicaid plan up here in New England. So I do a good bit of work outside of workers' comp as well.
Excellent. So I have to ask you, I was in preparation for our conversation, checking out some of your profile, and I saw you have a degree in anthropology. So tell me about your journey here. How do you go from that degree to the managed care workers' compensation space?
Well, I was not much of a student at my alma mater, Syracuse, and I was on the rowing team there and in a fraternity there. So anthropology was a way for me to get a degree while focusing on things that I thought were more important at the time. But anthropology, I think it's sort of the study of humanity and how humanity has evolved. And I think it's the best training you could have for working in any business or any organization, because it's really all about trying to understand what drives people and what motivates people and what the taboos are, how change occurs in cultures. And it also makes you sort of open up and understand that your perspective is your perspective, and Mark's perspective is his, and your watchers' perspectives are theirs, and you have to respect those differences.
Excellent. So you graduated from Syracuse, and then so what was your next step? I assume you have some kids, I believe you had mentioned earlier. So what did that journey go from Syracuse to today?
Well, I went to graduate school and I was going to get into the whole corporate health promotion fitness business. About halfway through, I realized that there was no money in that. So I shifted gears quickly over into what was called cost containment back then. And I got into healthcare cost containment and ended up going to work for a subsidiary of AIG that was involved in that business way back in the mid to late 80s. Went on to the Travelers, Liberty Mutual as well. And then I had the opportunity to work for United Healthcare. And after doing that for about a year, I decided that I was not the kind of person who needed to work in a big organization. Actually, the organization, I sort of mutually decided that. So I went out on my own, and I've been independent for about 27 years now.
Excellent. Yeah, I remember freshman orientation. At the time, I think I wanted to do physical therapy or sports medicine. I can't remember, and that everyone stand up that was going to select that as a degree, and half of the freshman population stood up and was like, "All right, I got to find something else. This doesn't make any sense." Plus, there's no money.
Yeah.
So Joe, I know you're out there in the industry, extremely active. I know you do quite a bit of publishing and speaking engagements. As you look at the space today, what's the current state of affairs? Where do you see there being opportunities still? Whether related to the pandemic or not, whether it be related to cost containment or not. What really keeps you up at night as you think we've got to kind of move this needle forward, or that there's risk or exposure within this space? So
I think there's a couple things. One is, I believe that workers' comp rates, premiums, et cetera, are still significantly higher than they should be. And there was a recent NCCI report that came out and essentially demonstrated that we're over-reserved by somewhere north of $10 billion, which in an $85 billion industry is a lot of money. And I believe that that's due to, and there's some data that actually backs this up, what I call the opioid hangover. 10, 12, 13 years ago, we were just getting into sort of the opioid era in workers' compensation. They were really starting to be overprescribed. And at one point, about 40% of drug costs were for opioids and similar drugs. Well, opioids increase claim duration, add to medical expenses, increase indemnity and medical costs. So there was this external exogenous factor that was driving workers' compensation claim costs higher. And I think that was a big reason that medical costs were going up, medical inflation was going up. But actuaries were looking in the rearview mirror, as they do, of course, and it took a while for them to sort of catch up to the impact that opioids were having from a financial perspective. We'll leave aside the societal impact, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Over the last 6, 7, 8 years, the industry's done a great job in reducing unnecessary and inappropriate use of opioids, to the point now where it's about 17% of pharmaceutical spend. So what's happening, though, is actuaries are still looking in the rearview mirror, and they think that and their numbers indicate that there's still this opioid problem. Well, that problem is a lot smaller now than it was. So that's, I think, why, combined ratios are in the high 80s. And, when you look at total profits in the business, it's been historically high for a few years. So my sense is that claim costs are still projected to be too high, et cetera, because of this opioid overhang. This is going to end, I would say, probably in the next couple of years or so. The takeaway from that is insurance rates are still too high because insurance carriers are looking in the rearview mirror and don't understand the impact that the great job they've done in reducing opioids has had, that the great impact that has had. So when I look at the business, as an employer, if you're questioning your rates, the first thing I would say is, have you guys factored in the overall reduction in opioids and how that's impacted our claims and how claims picture is different today than it was historically? So,
and you do think there'll be
a lot who are sort of thinking this way. So, and there are other people who have different opinions, which I certainly respect.
And you do think there'll be a self-correction, or do you think that it will require some kind of coordinated cost containment initiative?
So, great question. I think that employers, brokers, consultants need to push back on insurance carriers, stop-loss carriers, excess carriers, and make sure that they are factoring in the fundamental change in opioids and how that's affected claim durations, et cetera. Because I haven't heard of anybody really making an effort to do that. So I would encourage folks to be proactive about that, because, as I said, you're paying too much right now. And if not, then just go self-insured.
So, it's fall 2021. We can't escape the pandemic, COVID. It has touched every facet of our lives, and quite frankly, every corner of the globe. Has lasted much longer than anyone probably could have imagined in early 2020. What have you seen within the workers' compensation environment that in the reaction to COVID, and where do you see this type of pandemic and potentially future pandemics? How do you see that maybe changing how we approach workers' compensation in the future?
Oh boy, great question. I hope we have a couple of hours to go through this, but I'm burden your audience with that. So first of all, you got to understand where workers' compensation was coming from, and that was really coming from a perspective of, for 100 plus years, we were dealing with musculoskeletal conditions, which for 500,000 years we've known what musculoskeletal conditions are. That's been workers' compensation. And now all of a sudden there was this new thing that came along, this incredibly new disease that was morphing and changing, and we did not know how to handle it. So workers' comp, that was this really static business dealing with a very static type of medical condition, musculoskeletal stuff, is all of a sudden now have to adapt and revolutionize how it addressed claim intake, claim triage, claim reporting, claim qualification, medical management, all that stuff, essentially overnight. And for an entity, for an industry that is, excuse me, anything but adaptable and good at rapid change. I think the industry really did a very credible job in adjusting this. Do we make mistakes? Oh, heck yes. We made a ton of mistakes. But in any situation like this, that is going to happen. I think if you look at the data, what's been pretty obvious is that most employers, most insurance companies, regulators, et cetera, have stepped up and done what they could where they could to make that to make the pandemic, to mitigate its impact on employers from an occupational medicine perspective. They've opened up formularies. They've enabled care through telemedicine. They've done as much as they could to move and make these things happen. What has also been really interesting is there's been some really good data coming out of CWCI indicating that the claim denial rate for COVID is about the same as the claim denial rate for musculoskeletal conditions. So there was this concern early on that employers, insurance companies were going to sort of stiff arm and say, no, that's not work related. Well, for all the claims reported that were credible, in other words, there was a positive test, et cetera, the acceptance rate is about the same. So that concern that I think a lot of folks, including myself, had was not valid, which is great. A couple of the other things is that I had thought that COVID would lead to extensions in disability duration for non-COVID claims because people just did not want to go to a healthcare provider. Well, that hasn't been the case, and that's been proven from data from WCRI, NCCI, et cetera. So once again, I'm really happy to be wrong on that care continued. Going forward, I think the move to workplaces outside the office is not going to change. I mean, you're working from quote unquote home. I've done it for 30 years, so it's easy for me. But a lot of other people have sort of moved away, and I would expect that is going to continue. Clearly in a manufacturing, construction, other type of healthcare delivery, those things are different. But offices, the way workers' compensation claims are going to be handled, a lot of that is being done remotely today. And shockingly, people still work hard and still get a lot of stuff done. So I think the impact on workers' comp is going to be as much in how workers' compensation operates from a claims, underwriting, management, executive world than in actually how the risks that we actually handle.
I have a few follow-up questions, and they're probably in different areas. I'll respond. First one in reaction to your last comment, and I'll go back to a question around COVID in a second. When you change the work environment, you change the risk factor, you change the exposure. So right. As you shift to a work-at-home environment, doesn't not complicate? Well, one, doesn't it reduce the traditional kind of slip and falls, that you might see in some industries, and exposures to certain aspects of the work environment being at home? Do you not anticipate that you may see a trend that will lower risk from just a change in environment alone?
Entirely possible. It's also, if you slip and fall at home, how are you going to demonstrate that is occupationally involved? I think that's difficult to do. And, to their credit, I think most employers are doing what they can to, put in place ergonomics and equip people with the right working environment within the house to enable that. I think there will also be certainly a reduction in claims associated with the workplace because you're just not at the workplace, you're not walking to, you're not driving from there to go someplace else, et cetera. So I think there will be a reduction, but those are in the low frequency, low severity industries, like paper pushers like I do.
Retail, yep.
So that I don't think it's going to be that significant. I think to sort of push this thing along, and I'm going to go tangential here on you, sorry. I think the biggest impact on workers' comp in the not too distant future, potential impact, is going to be if the infrastructure bill goes forward. There's going to be a lot more construction, a lot more heavy industry, a lot more onshoring of heavy industry. And those are high frequency, high severity type of businesses that, this whole development of green infrastructure, improving the electric grid, all the stuff we desperately need to do. If that stuff becomes reality 2 to 3 years from now, I think we're going to see a bump up in claim frequency and claim severity from those industries, which will far outweigh whatever happens to those of us who don't work with our hands.
That's a fantastic point, especially when you think of the fact that we don't necessarily train individuals in either a vocational or a trade way as we did, so that you have that transferable skill, so that if you are in a heavy industry environment, well, maybe it's transferable from what you were doing previously. Now you may be bringing individuals into that environment that have never done that before. Great that we have a job and a career path and ability to earn, but maybe not so great for your body being prepared and equipped for that type of work and labor, and maybe exposing you to injuries that you maybe wouldn't have seen in years past. So that's a fair point for sure. On COVID,
completely agree on that. Completely agree.
Yeah, no, I speak to it from even just seeing it within my own family. Individuals going from a white collar type of environment to opening up their own type of business that's more heavy labor intense, and seeing injuries associated with that may have occurred otherwise, regardless of that, but seemed to be related to the fact that this was just a new requests from their body to move and act and be prepared than they were at sitting in a cubicle. So, on COVID, you mentioned kind of the durations being more in line than what you expected, and I'm curious with the data that you've seen around either comorbidities or the long hauler syndrome that we hear about. Has there been anything to say? One, is there a correlation with, is there pushback on the correlation with it being the workers' comp event that it was claimed to be originally? And two, are you even seeing that data in a prevalence standpoint, or is that more media driven from what you're seeing?
So, Mark, the biggest issue I think with COVID is there's so much misinformation out there about, is it dangerous? Is it not dangerous? Is the vaccine dangerous? Is it not dangerous? So, the most important thing I think is folks need to go to the sources that are highly credible and get their own information. CDC is clearly one of them. Most of the major news outlets are also, very credible, whether it's, CBS, NBC, et cetera, the big newspapers. But so a couple things about COVID. One is that what we're seeing today is representative of what's happened in the recent past. And up until the Delta variant blew up in India, we thought we were on a really good pace to get back to normal. Delta variant came along, and all of a sudden, it's the same stuff. It's like it's Groundhog Day. And now we have the Mu variant, which is even more problematic. So I just hesitate to sort of opine based on looking historically at this, because the biggest problem we have right now is because of the large number of people who still are not vaccinated, the virus is going to evolve in a way that makes it more efficient at infecting people. That's just what it does. It's a living, quote unquote, thing, and that's how it succeeds. So what really scares me is that we will get something that A, is more infectious than Delta, which is terrifying, and B, is more deadly or has more side effects. We just don't know if that's going to happen, but given what we've seen with Delta and the Mu variant, that does scare me. So what I would suggest is employers, risk managers need to be looking forward and saying, okay, this is where we are today, but we need to understand that we could well be in a different place. What would we have done 8 months ago if we knew Delta was coming? Okay, let's think about that, and let's take those lessons and let's apply them to where we're going forward. And the potential implications for that are not going back to work anytime in the reasonable future. Mandating vaccines, which a lot more employers are doing, which I completely and totally support. Enabling people who have had COVID to continue to work wherever that's possible, but also understand that we do not know about long haul and what the issues are. I was just talking to my barber the other day, and he still has not got his sense of taste and smell back. Well, if you've got COVID and let's say, you're a florist or a perfumer or a chef or something, that's obviously going to have a really significant impact on your ability to continue. And that's just sort of one tiny example. There's also incident reports of, so-called brain fog, anxiety, other issues that we have to be very sensitive to. And I think workers' comp folks have to approach this from a science perspective, which is what does the science say? But unfortunately, there's very little science around long haul. So entities are going to have to make the decision, how are we going to approach these? Are we going to fight these claims because there's no science to back it up? Or are we going to say, hey, this could well be related to COVID. Let's go ahead and help this patient. I would suggest that the latter makes more sense, because otherwise eventually the science will probably catch up and you're going to be responsible for most of those claims anyways. And it'll be a heck of a lot more expensive to pay for them retroactively than if you'd gotten involved in the first place, done the medical management, help that person get care and get fully back to work. So my perspective is that you got to be prepared for rapid evolution of this, for rapid change of this. And we just don't know where it's going. So let's look at what happened when Delta emerged, what we should have done then, and I think we'll be in a much better spot.
Fantastic. Joe, fantastic. You had me entranced there. I mean, you said some fantastic things there that I think that I can see that the good news for us, at least from my perspective, I do see organizations evolving and adapting to this. And I do see many that were, very adamant about, let's get back to what was the norm as quickly as possible, saying we've benefited to some degree by accelerating, our adaptation to this environment. Let's continue to focus on the future and not necessarily going back to the way things were. And I think, even outside of, from a work environment perspective, some of the positives that changes that we've seen is just more acceptance of environments that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. So a great example for me is on a large call, and some of the individuals had their children. One had a newborn in her arms as we're doing the presentation. That would not have, unfortunately, would not have been accepted in years past. And so I think it's allowed us to reevaluate our priorities in a way that we wouldn't have. And to your point, as organizations as well, look at themselves to say, one, what's right by our employees? Two, do we want to look forward and get ahead of this in a way that we can, understanding that this is continuing to evolve. So thank you for that. Last question for you would be probably one of the softer balls. If you had this magic wand of things something that you just wished you could change or wish that would be in place within this space, is there anything that comes to mind to say, we're missing this, or if we had this, it would transform, this current environment or any environment, quite frankly?
Well, so I've got about 17, but I'll try to narrow it down as much as possible. So I think we have to look at the successes we've had. And so, for example, workers' comp is often maligned for good reason, in some cases, industry. But what this industry has done in reducing overuse of opioids, we've cut out probably $1 billion in opioid spend, which in an industry as tiny as ours, which is less than 1% of U.S. medical spend, that is a ton of dollars. Way more importantly, though, is the positive impact that has had on families, on moms and dads and societies and towns and everything else. So I think it's a very difficult time in workers' compensation because of COVID, because of a bunch of things. But every now and then I think we have to look over our shoulder and say, hey, you know what? We're pretty darn good. We really took on this really difficult challenge with opioids, and we handled it correctly. We did the right thing. And in the vast majority of cases, and I have no problem in pointing out where that isn't the case, but in the vast majority of cases, we've done the right thing. Same thing with COVID. In most cases, we have done the right thing. Does that mean we cannot get better? Of course not. So the one other thing I would say is that what frustrates me most about this industry is the lack of basic understanding of the healthcare delivery system. This industry looks at healthcare as a line item, as numbers, as dollars, and that is just totally wrong. From my experience working with the Medicaid duals plan, the level of sophistication of medical management, the plan on which I'm the board of directors has, is about 15 years in front of workers' compensation, just in terms of value-based care, understanding the application of evidence-based clinical medicine, what's happening with hospitals and health systems and how they're incredibly sophisticated when it comes to billing. And they very much recognize workers' comp as a very soft target. And I think to a large extent, and I'll point the finger at the industry, we have been lazy and lackadaisical about that. because the amount of profit that hospitals and health systems are making off workers' compensation is unconscionable. So if we, as stewards of our employer customers' money, I think need to do a much better job in really fundamentally understanding the healthcare delivery system and the impact that that has. Because if we had known that back when opioids were emerging, we would have been on that even faster than we were. So I just look at that and say that is a cautionary statement for me. We weren't prepared for opioids. Okay, so what's the next thing that's going to hit us in terms of cost shifting? It's definitely going to be hospitals and facilities. So we got to be aware of that.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. So, Joe, if folks want to reach out to connect or to reach out for potentially a speaking engagement, I know you have a blog and you're on LinkedIn and other forums. Is there any particular area that would be best?
Sure. So the blog is joepaduda.com. Not a lot of Joe Padudas out there, so it's the only one there. And the website's healthstrategyassoc.com. And really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you, Mark. Great to see young professionals in this business as opposed to us old white-haired guys. So thanks for that. You give me faith that we're going to be okay.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Well, thank you again, and thank you all for listening to this episode of Beyond the Claim.
You've been listening to Beyond the Claim, a podcast for risk and claims leaders. To ensure you never miss an episode, please subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you use Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to give us a quick rating for the show. Just tap the number of stars that you think the podcast deserves. Until next time, stay curious and keep innovating.